Hello, High Rock. I'm so glad we get to dive into this text together today because it not only has a lot to say to me, but to our entire culture right now. About a year ago, someone got me really angry. It's not someone at High Rock, so don't worry, I'm not talking about any of you. Anyway, I felt hurt because the person was treating me like I don't matter. My opinions, boundaries, and rights don't matter. Even in retrospect, I believe that I was right to be angry. What was not right is the way I responded to that anger. In my rage, I fantasized about hurting him. And not just his feelings, like he'd done to me, but his body. I wanted to beat him up or worse. Now, I'm a pastor, so I know Jesus commanded us to love our enemies and pray for those who hurt us. And I did that, eventually. But it wasn't my first impulse, because I was angry. I wasn't trying to make things right. I was plotting revenge and treating him as less than human in the same way he had done to me. My point is simply that even if we know that we're supposed to love other people, and we truly want to, in reality, it's really hard because deep in our hearts, sometimes we're not sure they deserve it. And I know I'm not the only one who struggles with that, because I see it in the way that my kids treat each other when they're angry. I hear it in the heartbreaking stories you tell me about what's happening in your marriages, and families, and friendships. And you know where I see it most? Well, online, of course. It's widely acknowledged that people say things online that they'd never say in person. And almost every time someone shares a controversial opinion on Twitter, even about something legitimately debatable or relatively trivial, someone else threatens them with death, sometimes described in the most elaborate and disturbing detail. They don't simply want to bury those ideas, they want to bury your body. And this makes every debate a bit dangerous these days, especially the ones that really do matter. Recently, we've seen this in the abortion debates. Whether we're defending the life of the baby or the mother, people on both sides literally threaten to kill those who oppose them because life is so precious. We all intuit that something's askew with that. But many people also intuit that somehow this debate is different from many others. Today's text may help us see why. It won't give us simple answers, but it might expose why some of the simplistic responses getting the most play these days are insufficient. In addition, it can also give us at least a starting place to address the most fundamental questions that all of us have. Who am I? Why am I here? Why do I matter? And this is crucial, whether you care about abortion or not, because as depression, violence, and suicide are skyrocketing, it's clear that we need some help. Now, I wish I had time to resolve all these issues today, but all we can truly do in the time we have is start a different kind of conversation between you and other Christians as well as with God. I keep hearing that these days are unprecedented, and that's true as we consider our circumstances. But as humans, we've changed very little. People in every century and culture have wondered why we matter, why life matters. We hear this in Psalm 8 when David asks in prayer, "What are mere mortals that you should think about them?" Haven't all of us asked this question? Maybe not about humanity, but about me. God, why do I matter? Do I matter? This is a universal human question, and all of us ask the correlate question. Why does my enemy matter? Why shouldn't I just destroy them the way part of me wants to? And while the precise answers have been unique to each culture and individual, They're all variations of just 4 universal stories. The first 2 claim to be non-religious stories, while the second 2 are explicitly religious. But as we'll see, most of us are influenced by all 4 of them, much more than we may realize, and much more than we may want. The first story is that life doesn't matter. We're little more than complicated collections of cells temporarily traveling together before we return to the Earth and are recomposed into some other life form that's no more or less valuable than we were. There's no transcendent meaning to anything, so YOLO, just do what feels good. This story has always existed in various forms, but today it's best embodied by the philosophies of nihilism and secular humanism, which are enjoying a resurgence in recent decades and are unwittingly espoused by many of the young influencers I see online. This story states, while there's no transcendent meaning to life, we can make our own meaning and morality. As individuals or a culture, we can decide what's right for ourselves. There's no God or objective source to tell us who we are or what to do. We can decide which values and which people matter most. We can create our own identities so we can be whatever we decide to be. Now, at first glance, there's a lot of freedom here. But without any external foundation, that meaning and morality are established and enforced by those with the most power to serve their interests at the expense of others. In the end, people matter only to the degree that they please those in power. Again, this has always existed, but we see it most prominently in recent history in the devastation wrought by communism and Nazism. And this is why social media feels like the Wild West these days, because people are competing to see who gets to make the rules in this new culture. And at the moment, the most power is given to whomever is the most outraged. That's a result of the humanist story, in which we get to decide right and wrong for ourselves. This story often shows up in the abortion debate, as we decide which people matter, unborn babies or women. And we excuse dehumanizing the other one. And if I'm honest, this philosophy was influencing me when I was nursing my violent fantasies about that guy who upset me. His value was determined by his effect on me. But to summarize, the first story is that humans have no intrinsic value apart from anything we decide for ourselves. We like this story because it gives us lots of power. With no God or gods, we become our own gods. We can judge good and evil. The second story is that people are valuable to the degree that they deserve it. My ability to do or make something makes me matter. This is the achievement story, which is the basic tenet of capitalism. This explains why people who are rich, smart, strong, or successful are so revered in our society, including billionaires, Ivy Leaguers, entrepreneurs, and pro athletes. They're not just better at something, they're actually better, more valuable than the rest of us. But as I said, all of these stories leak into religion, even if they don't belong there. The achievement story is what leads to legalism. We believe that God cares more about those who memorize the most Bible verses or make the biggest sacrifices for others. Of course, both those things are admirable. But this is the worldview that justified the Pharisees to reject certain people who didn't deserve Jesus' compassion. This approach also suggests that those who cannot produce as much, including the elderly or the disabled, are not as valuable. This is why many medical decisions for those less productive people, including unborn babies, are often reduced to finances. We ask whether they're worth the cost to care for them. More personally, this is also why so many of us struggle with insecurity. I look at what I've done or what I can do, and I wonder if it's enough. Yes, I lead a church, but other people lead much bigger or more innovative churches, and I fear that makes them better than me. I meet a Celtic player and immediately feel inadequate because he's more successful than I am, if measured by income or fame or physical ability. I see someone who's much more attractive than I am, and I unconsciously assume he's more valuable than I am. This story leaves us constantly comparing ourselves to others, constantly questioning our worth, because even if we did something to prove ourselves in the past, do we still have what it takes? Once that pro athlete retires, does he still have as much value as a person? If I got an A last week, but a C today, am I still as valuable? The achievement story would answer no. And you can see why this leads to insecurity, depression, and despair at a personal level. And as a culture, it leads us to violence and division because we're forced to compete with other people to be valued. Since our basic survival depends on being valued by others, we can justify all kinds of cruelty or evil to ensure we win. So, the first story is secular humanism. The second is capitalism. And the final two stories are explicitly religious. The first of those holds that humans have value because they are created by a god or gods, but that those gods made us with different degrees of value. While this story has shown up all over the globe, it may be best represented by Hinduism, in which people of different castes have explicitly different value. But even in societies that claim to be Christian, it's what justifies monarchies. Those people are just born better somehow. I'd also suggest this is the theological justification for racism among Christians. Some of you know how the curse of Ham was manipulated to suggest that God values people of different skin pigmentation to different degrees. In this framework, black lives don't matter as much as white lives or blue lives. The Declaration of Independence proclaims, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." But as we've seen, that's not self-evident at all. Versions of these first three stories, which have been pervasive in our educations and moral formation, suggest that we're not equal, which may explain why we so rarely treat each other that way. And this brings us to the final story, promoted by the three Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which teach that we were not only created by God, but that we were created to uniquely reflect God. God's glory is embedded in us, which makes all of us unerasably sacred. In this story, my value to God isn't derived from my utility or achievement, but it's simply a gift from God to all of us, which makes it durable despite whatever I can or can't produce. And this is the story that we saw in our scripture reading today. Now, I've preached in detail about this another time, but Genesis 1 was never intended to be a step-by-step scientific explanation of the way God created the world. Centuries before modern science raised questions, Christian leaders like Augustine and Luther never believed Genesis teaches that the world was created in 6 days, but that each of the 6 stages of creation help answer our most fundamental questions about who God is, who we are, what we're called to do, and why each of us matters so much. Especially when other things God made are clearly superior to humans in some ways. The power of the sun, the size of the ocean, the beauty of a spider web or a sunset. As majestic as each of those are, Genesis insists that they're not gods to be worshipped, as most other religions held at the time, but just tools created by the one true God and totally subject to God's commands. They're created by God, and though you could discern things about God from what was made, much like I might guess some things about an artist from seeing a piece he produced, none of what God had made was truly like God. Humans, however, were different. After the first 5 days of creation, then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. It's the difference between an artist painting anything else and creating a self-portrait. The picture itself is still not them, but it tells you a lot more about what they're like. And this is the real point of the Genesis 1 story. To explain what makes us so valuable. We're like God in ways that the rest of creation is not. Last week, I spent hours reading and writing about what it means to be created in God's image. But this sermon kept getting longer and longer, and so I realized that by itself, that would take many hours to adequately explain. So let me summarize in a way that's admittedly inadequate. We reproduce new life, like God does. But so do rabbits. We work, like God does. But so do ants. We're social, like God is. But so are most animals. We're creative, like God is. But some animals are also innovative to a limited degree. Humans share all these characteristics, but in at least two ways, we're unique. The first is our ability to relate with God. God is the relationship between the three persons of the Trinity, eternally serving, receiving life from, and delighting in one another. Theologians compare it to a traditional circle dance in which everyone embraces and moves in perfect harmony. That three-in-one God created everything, but only humans were invited directly into God's dynamic dance of love. But then God opened the circle, and as we are led by God, so we are to lead the rest of creation in the dance. God commanded us to rule over creation, not in the sense of exploit it for our own ends, but to care for all God made on God's behalf. We are responsible to make sure that ecosystems are healthy and humming along as God designed them to. This is why the internet exploded back in 2015 over the dentist who shot Cecil the lion. Why were we so upset? Because it's in our bones that we're created to protect creation. Sometimes that includes protecting ourselves. But Cecil wasn't threatening anyone. He was killed for sport. The life God created was treated as a triviality. And we intuitively recognize that to be inconsistent with what humans are created to do. Likewise, pollution isn't something we should simply be worried about. It should be something we're embarrassed about. We're not taking care of God's creation the way God commanded us to. But our duty goes beyond creation to culture. We're sent to fill the earth with cities and societies that reflect what God is like, which includes beauty, truth, justice, and mercy. We reflect God by helping each other flourish. In this story, all humans represent God. So God takes personally the way we treat each other. Imagine that High Rock sent out a brochure with my picture in it. But when I stopped by your house one day, I saw the brochure and the picture of me, specifically, had been desecrated with mean-spirited graffiti. It's not like you literally drew on my face or said those things to me, but if you do it to my image, I take it personally. And that's how God feels when we mistreat each other. John exposes our hypocrisy. Whoever claims to love God, yet hates a brother or sister, is a liar. For whoever doesn't love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. And he's given us this command. Anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. And this is why I couldn't follow through on my violent fantasies against that guy who upset me. Yes, he was wrong. But God will deal with him about that because God takes personally the way other people treat me because I represent God. But God also takes personally the way I treat that other guy because as hard as it was for me to see in that moment, he represents God also. So to summarize, humans are unique, not only in the way that we can relate with God, but also in the way that we represent God by working in the world in a way that reflects the way God works. This is what we learn from the 6th day of the creation story. But then on the 7th, the Lord does something unexpected. And it says a lot more about the sanctity of life than we usually recognize. God stopped working. The text says that God was resting, but Psalm 121 is very clear that God never snoozes. So what's going on here? God is showing us what it means to be human on the first 6 days by working. But the crescendo is on the 7th when God accomplishes nothing. God knows how prone we are to believe that our value is derived from what we do, the achievement story that we talked about earlier. But we've already seen how dehumanizing and dangerous that can be, leading us to value certain people more than others. But it can also lead us to dehumanize ourselves, because that story promises that if we work more, we'll be worth more. So we work ourselves to death. A lot of us envy machines that can have superhuman strength or speed and don't ever need to stop for sleep. Advances in AI are making us nervous because machines are becoming smarter than us too. Sometimes when we see a remarkable athlete or coworker who seems to outproduce the rest of us, either with admiration or jealousy, we declare, "Whew, that guy's a machine," as if machines are superior to us fragile humans. This lie is what the Sabbath is designed to protect us from. It's a day when we stop reflecting God by working and simply relate with God by worshiping, praying, and savoring all the wonderful stuff God created. This is why many of us gather on that day to worship together and learn from God and spend the rest of the day playing, resting, or enjoying something God made. Maybe another person, maybe admiring nature or eating a delicious meal. Yes, we have work to do, but the Sabbath reminds us that we and everyone else are not valuable because of what we accomplish or achieve, but simply because we're created in God's image. We don't have to make ourselves valuable because God already did that. So enjoy a day just dancing with God and sharing God's delight. Enjoy a day to simply be human. So Sabbath is not a day off. It's a day on. It's a day to be who we truly are by relating with God and reflecting God in our relationships with others. It's a day to become more fully human. Well, this sounds wonderful, but knowing how captivated and manipulated we might become by the achievement lie, God didn't offer this as a suggestion. It's a commandment, one of the 10 commandments, in fact. And God doesn't just give us an instruction, but also an explanation. We read in Deuteronomy, "You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. All your male and female servants must rest as you do. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with his strong hand and powerful arm. That's why the Lord your God has commanded you to rest on the Sabbath day." See, the Israelites had experienced slavery in Egypt when, following the first and third stories we mentioned earlier, the people of Egypt didn't value foreigners as humans, but simply as biological machines who were only as valuable as what they could produce for those in power. Practicing Sabbath can protect us from the lure of those other 3 stories that compel us to devalue and dehumanize ourselves and others. It reminds us that all humans are sacred in a way that the rest of creation is not. A day of rest from our work can remind us that we were uniquely created to be in relationship with God and with one another. And then out of that relationship, we go back into work for the next 6 days to make earth a little bit more like heaven, which we got a tiny taste of on the Sabbath. And this is how learning about creation and Sabbath in the first pages of Genesis can help us respond differently to some of the challenges I raised when I began. David, who asked earlier why God would even care about humans compared to all the other amazing things he'd already created, finally realized you made them only a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. We are sacred beings because we bear the image of God. So many of us have been oppressed by the pernicious lie of secular humanism that insists that we have to create some kind of meaning for our lives because otherwise we're nothing. We have to invent a story to explain who we are and why we matter. We have to build an identity. In a sense, we have to create ourselves. But God has already created you. You already have a story, and God declares who you are, his beloved child, and co-laborer, chosen to be God's chosen representative because you reflect something of what God is like. So as we sing at High Rocks Family Camp each summer, I am somebody. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're not. You don't have to make yourself something. You simply have to discover what you already are. And not only don't I need to create my own identity, I don't have to compete with anyone else to be valued, because my value is not derived from my achievement. What I do can be valuable, but I am already valuable, despite anything I do or deserve, because I'm created in the image of God. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam have contributed to oppression, war, racism, and sexism. But I contend that it's not because of our story, it's despite it. It's when we've been enticed by one of the other 3 stories instead of being faithful to our own. And we've done that far too often throughout history. And we do that as individuals as well. Many of us are being crushed by lies we've believed about what makes us matter and need more time with the Bible or perhaps a Christian counselor to discover new stories about God, ourselves, and others that are more beautiful and true than those that are currently holding our souls hostage. When we get our story straight, it means that other people won't need to prove themselves either. We'll no longer value them according to what they produce or what they do for us, but because they reflect God. I might enjoy some people more, but all of them are sacred. And that means people of other nations and races are no more or less precious than you are, as are the elderly, the disabled, and infants, and even your enemies. Each of them reflect God in various ways. So what does this mean as we think about the abortion debate? It means that as much as we want to villainize and dehumanize people who disagree with us, people on both sides of this discussion can honor and reflect God in different ways by protecting the vulnerable and promoting compassion. So many of the arguments I hear in the abortion debate from Christians on both sides are more informed by secular humanism, capitalism, and a caste system in which we're encouraged to ask which lives matter more, rather than starting from the firm conviction that every life is sacred. Every person is created in God's image with the authority and responsibility to rule the world together in a way that makes every life flourish. I can reflect God by defending the life of a fetus because God is the creator of that life, and I honor God by the way I treat his image. But the woman carrying that child also bears God's image. So I'm also called to protect her from being manipulated by men without regard for her literal safety, her agency, and her dignity as an image bearer of God. If God gives people free will, perhaps we need to be cautious about taking it away. In this conversation, I'm a pro-life guy, which is a big part of the reason my wife and I adopted 11 kids. But many of those kids we adopted as teens, because we're not just pro-life until birth, we're pro-entire life. But I'm also pro-choice, because I want to give vulnerable women better choices than they have right now. Many women are compelled to get abortions they don't want by partners or family members who don't want the responsibility of a child or the potential embarrassment. They're willing to kill to protect their reputations. Other women end up getting abortions because they realize they can't give their child a life after it's born. Our society compensates for people for productivity, but not for parenthood, and is willing to pay to keep somebody in prison, but not to keep someone out of poverty. We've put pregnant women in a terrible bind and need to give them better choices. All this to say, even if we're committed to reflecting God in conversations about abortion, it's not always obvious what that means. What is obvious is that it changes the way we discuss it together. It's easier to just pick a side and then bury the very real complications under excessive outrage. Get power so that we can get our way and castigate or cancel anybody who disagrees with us. That seems to be a popular pathway these days. In Genesis 1, humans were commissioned to rule over creation. And in Genesis 3, God says that one of the symptoms of our sin is that men will rule over women. In English, these look like the same word, but in Hebrew, they're very different words with very different meanings. Genesis 1 made men and women co-regents, caring for God's creation and helping it flourish. In Genesis 3, the Hebrew word really means to control or manipulate for our own ends. So a better way to translate this verse might be, you will try to control your husband, but he will control you. Doesn't that seem like a pretty accurate description of what we see happening these days? As men try to control women's bodies, and some women want to completely cut men out of this essential conversation. Our story insists that we were called to lead together in a way that honors everyone, not chooses who gets control or who matters most. So, church, this cannot be the way that we discuss these issues, because it doesn't reflect the character and compassion of our God, nor does it honor the image of God in those who disagree with us. And God takes personally the way we treat those people, whether we think they deserve it or not. So, whether they're fetuses or pregnant women, let's treat them with honor, justice, and love, because God definitely deserves it.